Welcome to some very famous people you've never really heard of. Bite-sized biographies of the famous, the infamous, and the quirky in less than an hour. My name is Philip D. Gibbons, and there is more information about me, this podcast, and a bibliography at bitesizebiographies.com. There are also photographs of many of the individuals and items mentioned in this podcast. At the conclusion of part one of this presentation, there will be additional suggestions concerning further information about today's subject, Howard Hughes. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please like us at our Facebook page, Some Very Famous People, and follow us on Twitter at Philip D. Gibbons. Subscribe to my YouTube page at Noblesse Oblige. Please note that all of Bite-Sized Biographies are now available on YouTube, YouTube Music, and Spotify. And please tell a friend about Bite-Sized Biographies. On March 28, 1976, billionaire Howard Hughes was reclining in a sitting position on his hospital bed in his penthouse suite on the 20th floor of the Acapulco Princess Hotel in Acapulco, Mexico. Mexico was just another stop in a succession of hotel residences that Hughes and his small all-male entourage of attendants, gophers, and a personal physician occupied in the past decade, including renting entire floors in Las Vegas, the Bahamas, Vancouver, Canada, and London, England. But the reclusive billionaire was now dealing with the effects of several overwhelmingly debilitating physical conditions, deep psychological neuroses, and severe addiction to several narcotics. Plagued by untreated bed sores, he found it virtually impossible to lie down or get comfortable without resorting to one of the two drugs that he repeatedly accessed, codeine, which he routinely injected intravenously, or Valium, which he ingested in pill form, both in quantities that would have been fatal to individuals without his massive tolerance, built up during an abuse occurring for decades. In recent years, Hughes became so weakened by his voluntary confinement and lack of exercise that occasionally, during attempts to inject himself, he had broken off needles subcutaneously, deposits that remained in his limbs for the rest of his life. Obsessively germophobic, Hughes disliked individuals touching him in any way. Hence, he would allow a haircut on a basis that was so infrequent that his hair was now well beyond shoulder length. His finger and toenails also grown out to a length that was just as unkempt and visually bizarre. Although the penthouse normally afforded a spectacular view of the Mexican resort town via spacious windows, all of these apertures were completely sealed with plywood and black cloth, heavily taped in such a manner as to ensure that no daylight penetrated Hughes's quarters, and most importantly, presented zero opportunity for some enterprising journalist to obtain Hughes's photograph. The door that led to an exterior hallway was secured with a 2x4, preventing any access by the unauthorized. In previous years, Hughes would have tirelessly addressed his various business interests, communicating by phone and memo with the Los Angeles executive team that administered his holdings and carried out his wishes. But now, with his health rapidly declining and his mind practically gone, Hughes spent most of his time either engaging in narcotically induced sleep, compulsively watching the same film repetitively, or babbling incoherently at one of the 6 attendants who were stationed outside of his bedroom, frequently demanding fresh glasses of Poland spring water, unaware of the numerous glasses of the beverage already placed on the nightstand next to his hospital bed. Eventually reminded of their presence, he would then complain that they were too warm and had to be swapped out for a fresher, colder replacement. This process repeated tediously by the hour. As Hughes had begun refusing meals and even favorite foods like ice cream, This last ritual was by comparison a mere annoyance compared to the intricate processes that Hughes had previously demanded in the preparation and consumption of any of the nourishment he consumed. This latter proclivity induced a horrendous effect on what was Hughes's formerly 6'4" skinny but still healthy 170-pound frame. Later, those who observed him in his last days stated that he was so emaciated he resembled a refugee from a Nazi concentration camp. Now, on March 28th, he seemed to seek to further isolate himself from the other inhabitants of his luxury hotel cocoon. From the adjoining room, he summoned the attendant on duty and slipped him a note written on the yellow, legal-sized pad that Hughes used for his formerly meticulous and frequently voluminous memos on a wide range of topics. But now, written on a single sheet of paper, Howard would produce a succinct directive, the last words he ever wrote. "I do not want to be bothered. Unless I call you, I do not want to be disturbed for any reason." Naked underneath a single white sheet that covered his 93-pound body, unkempt and having not had a bath in months, Howard Hughes was a far cry from the dashing entrepreneur, record-setting pilot, airline and aircraft industrialist, Hollywood producer and playboy linked to every single A-list female star in Hollywood. Despite a net worth totaling billions of dollars in an era where such a fortune was extremely rare, Hughes was completely alone in a darkened room, not having communicated with a loved one or relative in decades, and about to begin his final descent. Howard Robard Hughes was born in Houston, Texas on December 24, 1905. His father, Howard R. Hughes Sr., forged a successful career in the oil exploration business. Following his May 1904 marriage to Aline Gano Hughes, the daughter of a prominent Dallas judge, Hughes Sr. settled down from his previously nomadic life of chasing oil strikes throughout the American Southwest. The couple's first child, Howard, was born in 1905, a childbirth that was so difficult that Mrs. Hughes was advised not to have any more children, a development with both long and short-term consequences. Initially, Hughes Sr. continued to prospect for oil, but ultimately focused on the equipment being used in the early 20th century to drill into the ground in search of petroleum. He partnered with Walter Sharp, an extremely knowledgeable oil prospector, and adapting several aspects of the current oil drill bit technology, developed a revolutionary design that allowed for much easier penetration of rock and solid obstacles that formerly took weeks to pierce. Hughes Sr. and his partner quickly formed the Sharp Hughes Tool Company, but with the 1912 death of Walter Sharp and Hughes Sr.'s determination to own the firm outright, by 1915, the now Hughes Tool Company was 100% owned by Howard Hughes Sr. By then, Howard Hughes Jr. was 10 years old, an only child raised by a mother who considered her son's upbringing a full-time job. She was overly cautious and zealously monitoring any possible illness or exposure to disease. Any modest physical change was met by a visit to a doctor, and any epidemics that threatened the region prompted an evacuation to some less threatening outpost. Hughes was a frail, quiet adolescent, undoubtedly not helped by a mother who could not bear to be separated from him and was constantly anxious about his physical well-being and potential exposure to illness and germs. At the age of 12, Hughes was also confronted by another formative incident, a 1917 riot of black soldiers stationed at Houston's Camp Logan, violence that resulted in the deaths of 17 individuals, including 4 police officers, prompted initially by perceived brutality perpetrated upon individual black soldiers by the members of the Houston Police Department. 19 black soldiers were eventually hanged for conduct during this incident. Many others received lengthy jail sentences. Nevertheless, Houston's upper class at the time considered the incident a demonstration of the potential savagery of the black community. Stories of dreadful atrocities and anti-black sentiment imbued in Hughes' lifelong racist and intolerant attitudes. Howard Hughes also was not a particularly attentive student, so much so that his father, intent on his son eventually attending Harvard, sent him to prep school in West Newton, Massachusetts. With Hughes Sr.'s oil drill business expanding to California, his father felt it appropriate that Hughes eventually enroll at the Thatcher School in Ojai, California. Hughes seemed to make the adjustment to the school and his new environment well until March of 1922, when his mother was admitted to a hospital for what was to be a routine surgical procedure. She never made it out of anesthesia, was pronounced dead at the age of 39. Howard Hughes' father was especially devastated by the death and withdrew Howard from school, admittedly to help him deal with his own trauma and loneliness. Initially, the plan was for Howard to live at home and attend classes at Caltech. Hughes Sr. got his sister-in-law, Annette, to take care of Howard, but that arrangement only lasted a year until Howard's guardian returned to Houston to marry her fiancé, Dr. Frederick Rice Lummis, an ancestor of the founders of Rice University. While Hughes Sr. continued to run his thriving business involving frequent travel, Howard Jr., it was then decided, would move to Houston, attend Rice, and live in the family mansion, again with his aunt and now uncle supervising. Howard's father permanently adverse to spending any quality time in a city that brought with it reminders of his wife's tragic death. Occasionally a meeting at the company's national headquarters in Houston among the management team that Hughes Sr. had assembled required his presence, and so it was on January 14, 1924, he found himself in a meeting with a senior manager when he suddenly stood up, desperately gripped the table in front of him, and then collapsed to the floor. Aged 54, without any warning, and only 2 years following the death of his wife, Howard R. Hughes Sr. was now suddenly dead from a fatal heart attack. His funeral, conducted at the Hughes mansion, was thronged by Houston's social and political elite. The deceased, an individual who had transformed the region's most lucrative industry. His son, only 18 years old, was now an orphan who would have to make his way through the world on his own. But, unlike some Dickensian character thrust into poverty and peril without any resources or opportunity, one immediate result of Howard Hughes' father's death was that it immediately made his son, an extremely wealthy individual, as the beneficiary of 75% of his father's estate, the other 25% going to Hughes Sr.'s parents and uncle. With the estate comprised almost entirely in stock of the Hughes Tool Company, Howard Hughes immediately stated that he would drop out of Rice and run his father's firm. Even today, such an audacious declaration from a cloistered 18-year-old would seem foolish. In 1924, it was perceived as practically unhinged. Having spent time with his father's brother Rupert while Hughes was in Los Angeles, the nephew quickly journeyed to California to discuss his future and console his grandparents who were devastated by their son's death. Rupert himself was no slouch. Yale-educated, he excelled first as the composer of numerous short stories and short novels, and then as one of the top screenwriters in the exploding silent film industry, earning what was then the monumental sum of $125,000 annually. He was also prominent as a high-profile industry figure, his lavish parties a regular Hollywood event. Soirees that Hughes himself had attended with his father, the teenager usually too shy to even talk to any of the prominent starlets that were also in attendance. However, Hughes now adopted a less compliant attitude. He firmly refused his uncle's suggestion that Rupert Hughes be named his legal guardian until the heir reached 21, and ignored advice to get his degree. He also rebuffed his aunt's attempts to convince him to return to Rice, a demand that prompted him to begin negotiations with his relatives to buy out their interest in Hughes Tool, the teenager now adamant that he wanted absolutely no constraints on his operation of his father's firm. His relatives reluctantly agreed, and by May 1924, he bought them out for $325,000, all from the cash reserves of the company, a risky move, but the type of fearless and possibly impulsive business decision that marked Hughes's career for the rest of his professional life. It also began the process of Hughes's alienation from what remained of the closest members of his family, and his paranoia concerning what he believed to be attempts to control his life and behavior. Unpredictably, Hughes did something that was uncharacteristic in terms of his future micromanagement tendencies. He left Hughes Tool Company alone, relying on the management team that his father had assembled. Although he subsequently ignored his father's stated wish that he get a respectable education, Hughes was an obedient son who revered his father and considered the company his parents' enduring legacy. Besides, he was impatient to pursue other interests and business opportunities, running Hughes Tool on a day-to-day basis of no interest. Hughes did devote some immediate attention to one aspect of his life, interaction with women. Although tall and good-looking, and now a millionaire, the heir had never even had many dates, much less a serious relationship. Although well-connected socially, he was shy and awkward, and women didn't find him particularly appealing. Typically, upon observing at a church social event a 21-year-old named Ella Rice, Hughes became infatuated and immediately began a courtship that was initially one-sided. Ella, a member of the Rice clan and one of the most socially eligible bachelorettes in the city of Houston, but Hughes persisted, and after only a modest amount of time, not only proposed, but insisted that Ella move with him to California. Hughes already intent on getting involved in the production of motion pictures. Ella refused, but Howard then enlisted his aunt, a Rice herself, to convince Ella's parents to make it happen. In a practically arranged marriage, Howard and Ella were wed on June 1st, 1925, only a little more than a year after the death of Howard's father. Rather than spending a lot of time socializing, Hughes instead focused on drawing up a will that did financially acknowledge his fiancée and maternal aunts, but significantly ignored Rupert and his father's parents. Also significant, the will designated the bulk of Hughes's estate towards the establishment of something he designated as the Howard R. Hughes Medical Research Laboratories, the 19-year-old already envisioning the estate tax implications of establishing a foundation. Composed with the aid of his father's attorney, the document was finalized and signed 2 days before his wedding. After a leisurely summer, Hughes and his wife traveled by train to Los Angeles, and in a portentous selection of a residence, the couple checked into the glamorous Ambassador Hotel, situated near the movie studios that fascinated Hughes. He was one of the first of the financial high rollers who showed up in L.A., determined to conquer the movie business, and he would certainly not be the last. When he lost $65,000 on his first film, so bad it was never even released, the industry snickered, and his family begged him to get back to Texas and the Tool Company. But, typically Hughes persisted. He shrewdly altered the charter of one of his tool bit subsidiaries, the Caddo Rock Drill Bit Company, to allow it to also invest in filmmaking, as well as leasing out drilling equipment. Hughes also figured that he needed some intelligent financial and business advice, and he hired a wily accountant and jack-of-all-trades named Noah Dietrich to oversee Caddo's Hollywood efforts. This decision paid immediate dividends, with Hughes's next production accruing a modest profit and positive reviews. Hughes then really rolled the dice, investing $500,000 in a film called Two Arabian Nights. He hired a veteran director, Louis Milestone, who left Warner Brothers after a bitter dispute, and the film became the box office smash of 1927-28, earning Milestone a Directing Academy Award in only the second year of the Oscars' existence. The director went on to direct several notable talkies, including All Quiet on the Western Front and Of Mice and Men. Hughes figured that his Hollywood future was probably solidified enough to buy a home in the trendy Hancock Park section at 211 South Muirfield Road. Hughes may have thought about moving closer to most of the rest of the Hollywood movie colony in Beverly Hills, but it was probably not a coincidence that Hughes's new home was only a block away from the much more modest residence of his now mostly estranged great-uncle, Felix. Hughes's Hancock Park mansion overlooked the eighth hole of the Wilshire Country Club, and Hughes and his wife frequently indulged the young producer's great passion, golf, opening a gate from his backyard and playing a few holes when they were in the mood. Hughes also began to pursue another serious hobby, aviation, quickly learning how to fly. Inevitably, he concocted the idea of making a film involving airplanes that ultimately resulted in the epic production Hell's Angels. During his previous films, Hughes had deferred to the director and the more experienced technical crew members, merely observing without injecting himself into the creative process. But during the making of Hell's Angels, his approach was much different, and he quickly burned through two directors before finally deciding to make the picture himself. Hughes's marriage was already in serious trouble by this point, and probably beyond repair. He used pretext to compel his wife back to Houston for extended periods, finding her clinging and uninteresting. In her absence, Hughes began to develop a proclivity for engaging with trysts with numerous starlets and aspiring actresses he met at nightclubs, including the nearby glamorous Coconut Grove. When Hughes ignored repeated phone calls and telegrams and continually broke promises to return to Houston, even for holidays like Thanksgiving and Christmas, his aunt finally got involved, demanding that he return to Houston immediately. One of Hughes's issues concerning such matters was clear to Noah Dietrich, who was summoned by Hughes to receive an offer of employment on Thanksgiving Day, and was also asked to spend Christmas with Hughes to take a train to Houston for the aforementioned appearance demanded by his aunt. It would become clear to Dietrich that Hughes had no real concept that it was a holiday, and in fact never celebrated them in any fashion. Even the trip to Texas to allegedly assuage his family and wife was a pretext to address state tax issues and interact with management at Hughes Tool. When he made it clear that she would not be returning with him to Los Angeles, they essentially separated. Ella Rice Hughes eventually filed for a divorce, which was uncontested and granted on December 9, 1929. Completely focused on Hell's Angels, Hughes considered the filming near completion when an industry trend rendered it obsolete. 2 years after Al Jolson's starring role in The Jazz Singer included audible songs and dialogue for the first time, silent films were no longer appealing to the public, and Hughes realized that he would have to redo many aspects of his film. One was even continuing with a female star, a Norwegian named Greta Nissen, supposedly playing an English love interest, but who spoke with a thick accent. Hughes quickly hired a strikingly attractive blonde but as yet unknown teenaged Jean Harlow. He poured $3.8 million into the film, even more into lavish publicity stunts like airplanes buzzing the film's premiere site at Grauman's Chinese Theater. With stunning aerial footage and unprecedented sensuality exploding on the screen, the film was a sensation. Hughes also embellished his role in the production of the film. Despite having written little of the final script revision and requiring major editing of the massive amount of footage shot, he created the public perception that he was the sole individual responsible for the film's development. He also embellished the financial return on Hell's Angels, claiming it cleared over $2 million. In fact, the film lost $1.5 million, but Hughes's reputation was established after the film generated $2.5 million at the box office, one of the most popular films of the time period. Hughes didn't have to worry about the actual loss. His tool company, Cash Cow, more than made up the deficit. In less than 5 years, Hughes had become a major player in Hollywood, no longer the rube once described when he first got to L.A. by Ben Hecht as a sucker with money. He would release a succession of films, most notably The Front Page and Scarface, the last two films actually written by Hecht, and Scarface directed by Howard Hawks. But the effort, cost, and even constant battles with censors over depictions considered too cutting-edge or risque soon took their toll. Hughes growing restless and looking for new challenges. In an age in which airplanes and the aviators who flew them were among the most high-profile individuals in the world, Hughes became fascinated by attempting to surpass both distance and speed records and also the engineering involved in this cutting-edge industry. He acquired a special U.S. Army Boeing pursuit plane, officially meant only for military use, but typically Hughes was able to pull strings and get his hands on one of these aircraft in 1932. After renting space in a Lockheed hangar and hiring a bunch of mechanics and engineers to improve the airplane, Hughes again decided to start his own aviation concern, and Hughes Aircraft was born. Only 18 months later, he won his first speed competition at a Miami air show. Hooked, Hughes then began to assemble a team to design his own airplane, named the H-1, and not only got the plane assembled, but vowed also to serve as the aircraft's first test pilot. Although safe to fly on paper, actually flying the plane was still a crapshoot. How it actually flew, if at all, still anybody's guess. Hughes ignored his chief designers and engineers who advised him to hire an experienced test pilot. The young entrepreneur ignored all such advice, simply stating that it was his plane and he would fly it. On August 8, 1935, from Mines Field, which today is better known as LAX, Hughes smoothly alighted and flew for 15 minutes over the region, reaching top speeds exceeding 300 miles an hour. Immediately after landing, he resolved to officially challenge the current airspeed record of 314 miles per hour. On September 13th, Hughes, in an official event sanctioned and photographically recorded by the National Aeronautic Association and witnessed by Amelia Earhart as one of three official judges, Hughes easily broke the current record with speeds as high as 355 miles per hour. The only hitch was a gas tank issue, which forced Hughes to bring down the plane roughly in an open field, his state-of-the-art landing gear making this less dangerous than attempting such a feat with a conventional airplane. The plane suffered only minor damage, and Hughes' only comment was that he thought that his aircraft could go faster. Hughes next set his sights on another speed record, the shortest time to traverse the transcontinental United States. He had his design team modify a Northrop Gamma, a plane much more suitable for distance flying, and only months after setting the speed record on January 13, 1936, he took off from Burbank Airport, headed to Newark, New Jersey, arriving there at 12:42 a.m., 36 minutes faster than the existing record. Believing he could make the trip in an even shorter amount of time, Hughes next requested that the H-1 be modified to allow for longer flights, the thought being that its speedy capability would cut even more time off of the record. Not particularly interested in making another film, Los Angeles' most eligible bachelor amused himself by being seen in public with several different high-profile female actresses. His first serious Hollywood relationship was with actress Billy Dove, and others included Ida Lupino and Katharine Hepburn, who shared Hughes' love of both golf and flying airplanes. But as would be the pattern throughout Hughes' love life, his aloof personality and personal idiosyncrasies extinguished any thoughts of marriage, and Hepburn eventually broke it off. Most likely, Hughes barely noticed, more focused on another shot at a transcontinental speed record. The aviator actually disappointed that he had only broken the previous record by a few minutes. On January 18, 1937, he again set off from Burbank in his repurposed H-1. The only difficulty he encountered was an oxygen mask failure that forced him to a lower altitude, but he still arrived in Newark in 7 hours, 28 minutes, almost 2 hours faster than his own existing record. Hughes' feat established him as the biggest celebrity pilot in the country, and he was personally honored at the White House by Franklin D. Roosevelt. Although Hughes was proud of his accomplishment, he disliked press attention, was always brief during interviews, uncomfortable within crowds which made him claustrophobic. However, he was not shy when attempting to market his planes and design ideas to the military, who briefly considered his aircraft, but passed for both political and technological reasons, believing that while fast, his prototypes were not suitable for combat. Hughes accepted this opinion for the moment, and then turned to the last major remaining speed record he had not yet attempted, a circumnavigation of the Earth. After considering several types of state-of-the-art aircraft, he selected a Lockheed 14 Super Electra. After the requisite redesign by his Hughes aircraft technicians, he flew the plane to New York on the 4th of July, 1938, indicating that he intended merely to fly to Paris in an attempt to break the still-standing record of Charles Lindbergh. Hughes was attempting to minimize press coverage and reporters, which he now considered intrusive and annoying, and crowds interfering with his preparation at Floyd Bennett Field. The roofs fooled nobody, and for Hughes and the crew of the Electra, now officially nicknamed the New York World's Fair of 1939 as a promotional favor, an indication that his flight also intended to promote international goodwill, the next few days were chaotic as crowds milled about the airport, intent on getting a glimpse of the plane and its charismatic owner. Although Hughes and his extensive support group were able to rapidly plan and produce both extensive changes and upgrades to whatever aircraft he piloted, and assess whatever logistical and weather changes of the route Hughes was considering, it did not mean that this preparation was slipshod or perfunctory. His circumnavigation involved extensive analysis concerning weather patterns, potential issues with his aircraft, and the most advantageous routes to minimize flight time. The team even anticipated the possible need for repairs, sending spare parts ahead to some of the major airports where the plane was likely to land along the way. Still, aviation, especially over the open ocean, in 1938 was still a new discipline, fraught with danger and technical unknowns that made such a feat a daring endeavor. With this in mind, and knowing that he faced a difficult takeoff with a plane heavily laden with fuel and a 5-man crew, including himself, at a little after 7 on July 10th at Long Island's Floyd Bennett Field, Hughes settled into the cockpit of the Electra and quickly proceeded down the runway, his plane slowly lifting off and proceeding north across the peninsula, heading for Long Island Sound. He took the same route as Lindbergh, passing over the southwestern tip of Ireland and proceeding to the French capital in half the time it took Lindbergh. After a minor repair, he proceeded to Moscow, landing and staying on the ground only long enough to fill up on fuel, food, and water for the crew. Leaving mid-morning, Hughes flew well into the night, arriving at the next destination, Omsk, a remote city midway across the Soviet Union, the airport later described as a glorified cabbage patch. In a matter of days, the World's Fair of 1939 had gone from Long Island to deep into the heart of Siberia. An even more remote Siberian destination awaited, the city of Yakutsk, 10.5 hours away by air. The Electra made it without incident, but upon takeoff a few hours later, the plane struggled to get beyond a mountain range whose altitude was mislabeled on their maps, Hughes clearing the 9,700-foot ridge by only a few hundred feet. It was 3 p.m. Wednesday on July 13th when the plane landed at Fairbanks, Alaska. Only 2 stops remained, Minneapolis and then on to New York, the crew pausing in Minnesota for a little more than a half hour, the crew excited about completing the mission. Hughes was told by radio as they approached the New York City area and Floyd Bennett Field that crowds would not be a problem, but as he descended through the low clouds in the vicinity of the airport, he was startled to see many thousands of people, both surrounding and actually spilling onto the runway he needed to use. With some dexterity, he was able to land among a crowd estimated at 25,000 people, all hysterically attempting to mob the airplane. The World's Fair of 1939 landed at 2:37 p.m. on July 14th, the journey completed in a record time, circumnavigating the Earth in 3 days, 19 hours, and 17 minutes. Despite the crush of people, Hughes eventually made his way to a reviewing stand where he was officially greeted by Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia. When offered a chance to speak, the exhausted aviator, who flew the plane during the entire journey, faintly said only, "I am ever so much honored. Thank you very much." Hughes was conveyed by limousine to what was to be another reception at a private home in Greenwich Village. Instead, utterly uninterested in giving any more interviews or hobnobbing with politicians, he snuck out the back door and hailed a cab. He intended to head to Katharine Hepburn's apartment in Midtown, but with dozens of astute reporters and photographers camped out on her doorstep, Hughes instead headed for the Drake Hotel and a good night's sleep. He would need it for the next day, a ticker tape parade throughout lower Manhattan with an estimated 1 million participants showering him with both confetti and adulation. He participated in additional celebrations in Chicago and Washington, D.C., and despite a growing irritation for such events, he agreed to one final honorary event in his native city of Houston. In a speech at the Rice Hotel banquet in his honor, after an official greeting from the governor of Texas, Hughes concluded by saying with a bit of very uncharacteristic emotion, "Let me tell you one thing, this day will never be forgotten by me." When Hughes left town, piloting the World's Fair of 1939 himself, of course, he now left from the city's airport, which was hastily renamed after him. While Hughes publicly stated many times that his aviation exploits were meant to encourage international goodwill and demonstrate the quality of American planes and technology, privately Hughes was intent on exploiting his now massive nationwide celebrity by building Hughes aircraft into a powerhouse like Douglas, Northrop, and Lockheed. On the eve of World War II, the U.S. government's focus on aviation emanated from one major location, Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. Despite his best efforts to ingratiate himself with officials at Wright Field, and subsequently, once the war broke out, with the War Production Board, the U.S. government agency that focused on military industrial production during World War II, Hughes got nowhere. In fact, his efforts were so futile that he returned to motion picture production, developing a project with an unknown Jane Russell entitled The Outlaw, a ponderous Western yarn involving Billy the Kid. Russell was one of many young aspiring actresses signed to exclusive contracts. Hughes's method of ingratiating himself with young, attractive women, many of whom he had no intention of ever utilizing in a film. Instead of much of a script or even a story, Hughes fully intended to focus solely on Jane Russell's well-endowed figure, incorporating what was for the time remarkably risque and revealing perspectives of her breasts, an intention that eventually generated a great deal of opposition from the various ratings agencies and film boards that focused on maintaining American standards of decency. But as the cameras rolled and Hughes inserted his heavy-handed input into the film, that all was a problem to be worked out in the future. Hughes's prospects for a military contract improved when he was contacted by the industrialist Henry J. Kaiser. Kaiser had already established himself with the U.S. government by originating the rapid production of cargo transports known as Liberty ships, which were an integral part of supplying especially the European war effort. But as German U-boats began to ravage Allied merchant fleets in the immediate aftermath of the U.S. entry into the war, Kaiser began to brainstorm the possibility of constructing a cargo airplane with the capacity of a merchant ship, much like the massive C-5 military transport planes of today. Understanding that such a project required monumental research, development, and expertise, Kaiser sought out Hughes, who was described to him as a cutting-edge aeronautical engineering expert. At first, Hughes did not think such a project was even feasible. Based on the shortage of materials, the plane would have to be constructed out of wood and would still weigh 200 tons. But Kaiser's enthusiasm and agreement to be responsible for actually building the planes, once Hughes came up with a design, got him to reluctantly agree to the project, despite serious doubts that it could be brought in under deadline. Kaiser, with his influence in Washington, then got the government to put up $18 million for the project. In November of 1942, Hughes had his first signed agreement to produce an airplane for the war effort. Contractually, it was referred to as the HK-1, initials stemming from the names Hughes and Kaiser. To the design team, it became known as the Hercules. And eventually, to the public at large, a less respectable nickname would be bestowed, the Spruce Goose, a name that personally outraged Howard Hughes. Told by various aviation experts that building such a plane, especially under the specified deadlines involved, was impossible, Hughes set about defying the experts. But from day one, he had serious reservations that it could ever make the deadline. Hughes had already finished producing the Outlaw by 1941, but that was the least of his problems in terms of getting the film in front of the public. The film already did not pass muster with the Hayes office, the movie industry's own attempt at self-censorship guidelines. While Hughes agreed to edit a brief amount of offensive cleavage, 20th Century Fox backed out of its distribution deal, sensing eventual trouble. Instead of tamping down the film's lurid appeal, Hughes hit upon the scheme of drumming up outrage amidst the public by surreptitiously having some of his film company employees contact ministers and politicians and informing them of the imminent release of a filthy and immoral film called The Outlaw, starring Jane Russell. This coincided with a national poster campaign featuring a rendition of Jane Russell reclining sensuously on a haystack, adding to various church and governmental officials' outrage over such lewd content. Without a distribution deal in place, Hughes leased 2 movie theaters in San Francisco and showed the film on a reserved seat, higher-priced admission basis, selling out for 7 weeks and generating the largest gross in San Francisco history up to that time. But police threats over the poster, the Catholic Legion of Decency condemned designation, and difficulty obtaining either another distribution deal or another location to show the film prompted Hughes to remove the film from exhibition for the moment. For Hughes, it probably was a wise decision, as problems with his military contract would require his sole focus. A complete vacuum of management leadership at Hughes Aircraft and the inability of Hughes to delegate authority ensured that any possibility of completing even a single prototype of the Hercules was lost. By the time Hughes got around to hiring a general manager in June of 1943, only a month before the plane was contractually required to be delivered, this individual, Edward Byrne, was confronted with an operation rife with interdepartmental hostility and many refugees from the motion picture portion of Hughes companies who were completely unsuitable for their positions and rarely showed up to work in any case. After several weeks of butting heads with the established clique of Hughes old-timers from Hughes Tool and elsewhere, Byrne decided his only course of action was a face-to-face meeting with Hughes himself. He demanded that certain employees be removed from the flying boat construction supervision or he would quit. Hughes refused to fire anybody or even really intervene in any meaningful way. Byrne was out the door in 2 months. Despite this chaos, Hughes Aircraft was placed on a list of entities in consideration for another contract to build 100 high-altitude photo reconnaissance planes. The committee to review plants and facilities for this contract was headed by FDR's son, Elliott Roosevelt. Instead of substance, Hughes decided to wine and dine the Roosevelt contingent when they got to Los Angeles. His employee PR executive with deep Hollywood connections, John Meyer, leading them on VIP tours of film studios and treating the group to entertainment at top-shelf restaurants that included an introduction of Elliott Roosevelt to actress Faye Emerson. Meyer even tried to pick up the check for the contingent's lodging until Roosevelt drew that ethical line. When the Roosevelt Committee headed back east, Hughes continued the onslaught, Meyer underwriting entertainment at such nightclubs as the Copacabana and the Stork Club. Faye Emerson, who seems to have made quite a hit with Elliott, was included in the proceedings. Not surprisingly, in August of 1943, Roosevelt submitted a report to Air Force Commander Henry Hap Arnold that unequivocally recommended Hughes Aircraft for the contract. Arnold was fully aware of both Elliott Roosevelt's interest and the influence that Hughes could bring at the highest circles of Washington politics. He ordered that the contract be awarded to Hughes. even though it was against his better judgment at the time. Initially referred to as the D-2, within Hughes Aircraft, the contract renamed the plane the XF-11. On paper, Hughes should have been encouraged by this development and the acquisition of a $43 million contract, but delays and cost concerns involving the Hercules had Air Force regulators intent on killing that project, believing that it would go way over cost and couldn't be produced in a timely fashion. Hughes spent much of the winter of 1943 personally meeting in Washington, D.C. with anyone who could help keep the project alive. In the end, it took a personal intercession with the president himself by Secretary of Commerce Jesse Jones, a fellow Houstonian. Even then, in what was actually a fortuitous development for Hughes, and knowing that much of the original $18 million allocated for the project was already spent, Air Force procurement canceled the original contract and said that Hughes could build one instead of three of the cargo planes for the same $18 million. Between finishing the Hercules and fulfilling the XF-11 contract, Hughes knew he needed outside help. He did something he had never done before in offering an experienced aviation executive, Charles Perrell, stock options in the fledgling Trans World Airlines Corporation, then a subsidiary of Hughes Tool, as well as a way above market salary after Perrell initially turned him down. It was fortunate that Hughes was able to secure this type of expertise because in August 1944, Hughes seemed to have suffered the first truly pronounced mental health crisis of his life. In a response to the incredible stress he was under, he simply disappeared, completely unresponsive to the day-to-day demands of running his various businesses. Only a few executives like Noah Dietrich, who was essentially running Hughes Tool at this point, even knew of his absence. But Dietrich and the other members of this small circle had no idea where Hughes physically was. It would be decades before this chapter of Hughes's life was explained by his longtime air mechanic Joe Petrali, explaining in a magazine piece that he and Hughes had merely flown for weeks in a triangle from Palm Springs to Las Vegas to Reno and back again, avoiding any work concerns or interaction and staying in hotels under assumed names. For Perrell, this lack of interference was probably a godsend. He consolidated departments within Hughes Aircraft, made progress on both contracts, despite predictable opposition from entrenched employees. In Hughes' absence, he was able to wield authority and actually complete the design of the XF-11, manufacturing two of the reconnaissance aircraft. However, already so dysfunctional a process, in May of 1945, and the war in Europe concluded, the Air Force canceled the order for the other 98 planes with instructions that the two prototypes be completed. Hughes eventually returned from his self-imposed exile and immediately clashed with Perrell, mostly over issues dealing with Hughes undermining his authority within Hughes Aircraft. Noah Dietrich from day one had considered Perrell a threat to what Dietrich considered his special relationship with Hughes. And when the boss asked him to fire Perrell, the executive was more than willing to comply. Perrell was gone after only 17 months. Hughes enjoyed one unrelated success with the film The Outlaw, which, after censorship battles and endless cheesecake tabloid publicity, now enjoyed a practically cult-like interest. In March of 1946, the film was initially re-released in, of all places, Richmond, Virginia, and eventually exhibited in Chicago, Atlanta, and Salt Lake City, breaking records and by the end of 1946, grossing $1.75 million. But by then, Howard Hughes was in the midst of enduring a life-changing event that had occurred on July 7, 1946. Already aware of Hughes Aircraft's reputation in the aviation industry for producing two flops during the war, Hughes was determined to prove that his aircraft were state-of-the-art vehicles that were not a waste of government funding. Although the government requested that Hughes conduct the tests at a U.S. military facility in the Mojave Desert and employ an experienced test pilot, Hughes characteristically refused, stating that he would personally conduct the test from the Hughes Aircraft Test Facility airstrip in Culver City. In attendance at Culver City among the technicians and airport employees was 19-year-old Gene Peters, a starlet and beauty pageant winner under contract at 20th Century Fox. Hughes had met her at a July 4th party, and the 40-year-old decided to try and impress her by inviting her to what he believed would be an impressive showcasing of his airplane. At 5 p.m., after a few preliminary runway taxiing tests, Hughes ascended into the West Los Angeles atmosphere. He immediately ignored the Air Force mandated flight plan and retracted the landing gear, an initial test flight only supposed to determine a plane's flight performance. When the landing gear warning light turned on, Hughes lowered and retracted it several times and maneuvered the plane until the light went off. At an altitude of 5,000 feet, the plane was performing appropriately other than the initial landing gear malfunction, but Hughes then exceeded the 45-minute limitation on flight time specified by the Air Force. Taking off with 1,200 gallons of fuel instead of the mandated 600 gallons, perhaps Hughes did not want to be constrained time-wise and be forced to land based on a fuel consideration. 75 minutes into the flight and heading in a northerly direction away from Culver City, suddenly the XF-11 lurched to the right, the plane forcefully pulling in that direction. Hughes could have immediately turned back to the airfield, but he stubbornly wanted to figure out the issue and rectify the problem while airborne. He adjusted the landing gear again, thinking a door might be open, and then increased power, first to both engines and then just to the right engine. Nothing worked, and now the plane began steadily losing altitude as the right downward pull became more pronounced. Below him, he could see with ever-increasing visibility the main thoroughfares of West Los Angeles until, at only 500 feet, Hughes crossed over Santa Monica Boulevard, heading into the main residential area of Beverly Hills. Perhaps Hughes believed he might be able to make it to the nearby golf course at the Los Angeles Country Club. Instead, the plane, nose up, smashed into the second story of a home at 803 Linden Drive, pitched violently to the right wing and engine, damaging the house at 805 Linden Drive before what was left of the plane skidded through one of the alleys present throughout Beverly Hills, the wreckage catching on fire between two houses on the next street to the west, Whittier Drive. A Marine sergeant visiting some friends in the area heard the crash and came running into the street, and seeing the flames ran to the scene just as Hughes managed to drag himself out of the shattered fuselage. This individual, William Durkin, quickly pulled Hughes away from the burning aircraft, and fire that set at least one residence ablaze. 808 North Linden Drive burned to the ground, but was unoccupied, and no one else was injured. Hughes was rushed to the hospital before Durkin had any idea as to who it was he had rescued, only finding out later from news reports. In hospital, it was not believed that Hughes would even survive overnight. He had 7 broken ribs, a broken collarbone, 1 collapsed lung, the other injured, a deep cut in his forehead, second-degree burns all over his body, and a heart forced against his crushed chest cavity. Surprisingly, Hughes did not lose consciousness, although he did enter into shock. In extreme pain, doctors administered injections of morphine, completely justified under the circumstances. Messages and inquiries came in from all over the U.S., including from President Truman, all wishing him well. But despite his precarious condition, Hughes remained fixated on the performance of his aircraft. When he was visited by Joe Petrali and another engineer, Glenn Odekirk, he emphatically told them about the right pull on the aircraft and requested they inspect the wreckage for mechanical evidence as to what happened. They quickly determined that an oil leak in the right engine caused one of 2 propellers to suddenly begin spinning in reverse, causing the downward right force of the airplane. Unfortunately for Hughes, who was intent on blaming the crash on a mechanical error, the Air Force official investigation concluded that his improper retraction of his landing craft, excessive time in the air, and failure to immediately return promptly to the airfield were the actual causes of the crash, which was then deemed due to pilot error. Upon hearing these details, Hughes became even more determined to leave the hospital as soon as possible, and he was discharged on August 12th. However, Hughes still required medical attention, and his rented Beverly Hills residence was staffed with caregivers on a 24-hour basis. His doctors, influenced by Hughes's complaint of chronic pain and demands for more intravenous painkillers, switched the aviator from morphine to the less powerful codeine as a precursor to weaning him completely off of the drug, a decision that had long-term consequences. As a result of their investigation into the crash, the Air Force officially notified Hughes that he was not permitted to serve as a test pilot for the second XF-11, an ego deflation that especially irritated Hughes to the extent that he personally headed to Washington to attempt to rectify the situation. He pulled strings until he got the actual commanding general of the Air Force, Carl Spaatz, to reverse this decision. Although Hughes's notoriety could affect those kinds of high-level interventions, it also had drawn the attention of Republican politicians having regained control of Congress in 1946, looking to exploit what was rumored to be an inappropriate contracting process between Hughes and the Democratic Roosevelt administration. Rumors about the process that had gotten Hughes his two contracts had swept through the Capitol, especially after Elliott Roosevelt married Faye Emerson within months of meeting her via the Hughes connection. Hughes also made waves by getting the Civil Aeronautics Board to grant him the right to fly routes across the Atlantic with his rapidly growing civilian airline, Trans World Airlines, also known as TWA. This was a direct threat to the previously preeminent international American airline Pan American, so well connected in Washington that it was considered practically a government agency. In January of 1947, a U.S. Senator from Maine named Ralph Owen Brewster announced that as chairman of a special Senate subcommittee investigating the National Defense Program, his first investigation would involve an examination of the process that awarded Howard Hughes his two defense contracts. Brewster was known in Washington as someone in the pocket of Pan Am and most likely intent on harming TWA and Hughes as much as possible. Initially, with Hughes' closed-door testimony in D.C. before the committee, the investigation seemed innocuous, but this changed when a Senate investigator flew to L.A. and requested various Hughes business records, including Hughes' aircraft expense account documentation. Hughes put the investigator off, in the meantime embarking on a successful 90-minute test run of the second XF-11 on April 5, 1947. But this PR attempt still did not stop the pesky investigators from continuing their demands for expense records related to the contracts, ultimately under threat of subpoena. And when records indicated that Hughes' PR effort had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on wining and dining Democratic government officials, the investigation became a much juicier story. When the committee began to hold public hearings on July 28, 1947, the Senate conference room was packed. The senator who called the session to order was Homer Ferguson of Michigan, a former prosecutor given the task of cross-examining witnesses. Hughes already knew that he faced potentially serious consequences in the court of public opinion if he allowed the subcommittee to trample all over what was undoubtedly a highly questionable procurement process. He proactively asked his friend, William Randolph Hearst, to allow him to write articles about the truth behind the investigation. Under his own name, he released a series of powerful press broadsides that ham-handedly charged that the entire hearing was nothing more than an attempt by Senator Brewster to punish him for refusing to merge unfavorably with Pan Am, and that Brewster was a hypocrite who twice flew for free on Hughes-provided aircraft and was completely compromised by his own relationship with Pan Am. Articles trumpeted throughout the tabloid Hearst empire. Immediately on the defensive, the committee had to spend most of its time addressing these allegations. When the committee then cross-examined PR executive Meyer, he made a laughingstock of Ferguson with wisecracks and one-liners that left the standing room-only crowd raucous with laughter. When Ferguson asked Meyer what good the $169,000 spent on entertainment had done, with perfect timing, the PR man responded, "It helped me. I met a lot of people." The conference room bursting out into laughter that infuriated the pompous stuffed shirt Brewster. But the climax of the hearing and the moment that the spectators, press, and audience listening in on nationwide radio broadcasts were waiting for occurred on August 6th when the final witness, Hughes, was scheduled to personally testify. Typically, he kept the committee waiting, and showing up 40 minutes late, he entered the Senate caucus room accompanied by an attorney and Noah Dietrich. Well before the bizarre behavior and reclusiveness of his later years, at this point in his life, Howard Hughes was publicly perceived as an aviation hero and patriotic American, and the little guy being harassed by a bunch of vindictive politicians. This perspective was clearly underlined when his entrance was greeted by spontaneous applause from the audience in the Senate chamber. Hughes took a seat, sporting a newly grown mustache to hide facial scars resulting from his recent air crash. He clearly went on the offensive, demonstrating that he was not intimidated by either the moment or the committee. It took almost a dozen questions to get specific responses to simple questions concerning his legal name, address, and official corporate title. Hughes then continued by calling the entire investigation illegitimate and that he was an honest businessman victimized for political reasons. He spent 5 days on the witness stand, Ferguson unable to lay a glove on him, and in fact Hughes putting the entire committee on the defensive by again raising the specter of a Pan Am-driven campaign of harassment. Despite the rather shoddy results of both contracts, Hughes was able to play the ultimate trump card that he had actually lost $7.5 million of his own money completing the Hercules, but felt obligated to finish the plane out of patriotic duty, not to waste government money or make an obscene profit. To repeated jabs over the fact that the Hercules had never even gotten off the ground and might not be able to fly, Hughes responded that the plane's function was partly experimental, served a unique purpose, and was not meant to, quote, haul excursion passengers from Coney Island to Staten Island. Captured on newsreel, and perhaps his most eloquent defense of his plane and his company, Hughes admitted with histrionic solemnity that perhaps his biggest mistake was working too hard and with my own two hands, and that perhaps the plane might not be able to fly, but if the plane failed, I might just leave this country and never come back. Hughes's appearance and performance prompted Brewster to suspend hearings for 3 months, but like a one-sided prize fight, it was perceived on Capitol Hill that Republican senators realized that the entire hearing had become an embarrassing circus that Hughes had completely dominated. He left the day after his testimony, now obsessed with another idea that he felt would end any criticism once and for all, an actual test flight of the Hercules, implemented as quickly as possible, ending the sarcastic Spruce Goose government boondoggle label permanently. Thank you for listening to part 1 of this podcast about Howard Hughes. Information for this podcast came from the books Howard Hughes, His Life and Madness by Donald Bartlett and James Steele, and Hughes, The Private Diaries, Letters and Memos by Richard Hack. There are also additional photographs, bibliographical and musical information at bitesizebiographies.com. Thank you for listening, and tell a friend about Bite-Sized Biographies.